Leith. Here is another presentation, I guess, of what we would go over, given the amount of time that we have left in the semester and some of the feedback that I got before everything changed. I want to focus on the treatment of trauma. And so I'm going to go over how I have gone about working with treatment. Um, and start helping you guys understand the groundwork for what you'll be doing when you work with survivors. So this won't be a terribly long presentation from me, mostly because I really want you to watch that video from Jim Hopper, the Harvard one, not the Stranger Things one. And that will take some time, and I think you'll see, hopefully, at the end of this, why I really wanted you to to see that video and understand where he's coming from. So let me get started here for the treatment of trauma. So the key things when you're working with a trauma survivor, here are some key things to remember: intrinsic processing, post traumatic growth, hope, and the pain paradox. Intrinsic processing, this is a really good way of looking at the wellness model, or an example of the wellness model in action. And that is to think of it as symptoms serving a function. So, trauma survivors will often have those very classic PTSD symptoms. Even if they don't have PTSD, it might be the flashbacks, the hypervigilance, the intrusive thoughts, and really what the accepted mindset is now or currently is that that is the mind's way or the brain's way of trying to process what happened. It is the intrinsic processing. Um, those symptoms serve a function. One is to process that event, and the other is to protect it. The body is trying to keep this damaging traumatic event from happening again. So that's where that hypervigilance comes from. So, for example, if you were attacked in a dark alley, then the next time you go in a dark alley, you're going to automatically kind of get hypervigilant so that this doesn't happen again. Another way of looking at it, I had a client, when I explained this, just instantly kind of wrapped his head around it and said, so this is sort of like a misplaced file in my brain, that there was this event and I can't make sense of it. It happened, it was horrible. And all these things I'm experiencing is me trying to figure it out. And that was a really good, clear explanation of it, right? The frustrating part is that people don't have control of it, right? That's where people get frustrated. That, okay, fine, I get that this thing was not my fault, beyond my control. I even understand that I'm gonna heal from this. But right here, right now, today, I'm frustrated because when I start falling asleep, I jolt awake. I have these memories, I have nightmares. That is frustrating. So, not to rush us to the end of this, but then as a clinician that part of what you're going to work on is coping with this processing, right? And it can interfere with a person's life, right? It's difficult for a person to go on a date now. It's difficult because they have other commitments. They might have, they have work. They have a regular, boring old 9 to 5 job, and it's not that that's triggering or anything like that, but it's because the day before they can't sleep, right? And they can't eat, and so they're tired and they're lethargic and they're distracted, and it's those what's the saying? It's a death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's all these little things add up, and that's what leads to the interference. But this is good for clients to know, and this really is a reframing from 50 years ago or more, where it was just uh, someone who experiences trauma has experienced damage, and this is the result of that damage. This is someone who is broken, right? That really negative, either or model of health. Now it's accepted that this is a person's way of trying to make sense of this thing, heal, and protect itself. And so, what counselors then do is we become part of that process. From that process comes the post traumatic growth, um, just like it sounds, right? So, the goal, just not just for trauma, but specifically for trauma, I guess, is it's not ever to get over something, right? I promise you that your client coming in will have had someone in their life say, "What do you need to get over it?" Or "It happened a long time ago," or just give it some space, things like that. We're not talking about getting over it. We're talking about learning and growing. Here was my life before the event. Here is my life after. What has changed, right? So we talked about this before when we went over the suicide and crisis counseling hope and what that kind of sounds like. And it isn't, I wrote this in the funny, there's some meme with SpongeBob, but it's not just don't worry, it gets better, right? Don't say that, right? Hope means your understanding that I'm not always going to feel this way, and it's going to be difficult, and I know I can do it, right? So, based on your theory, this idea of hope shows itself in different concepts. For you, person centered folk, it would be self actualization. For motivational interviewing, it's the energy to move forward, it's motivation. For you, one or two Freudian people, it's the having a healthy ego. Um, for DBTists, it would be um, I know that this is awful and that I will also survive it, right? So it's developing future goals, and that even though it's difficult and maybe it is a two-step forward, one-step back process, I can reclaim power. So it's not just one day this won't bother me, it's that I can do this today, right? This was rough and I'm still standing. A lot of it also just kind of on I guess a pseudo personal note based on my work with survivors. Trauma is incredibly invalidating, right? It's the idea of I am still worthy, I am still worth something, I still matter, and I don't feel that right now. But there's this little seed in me that understands that I'm still relevant and I'm still worthy of love and respect and dignity and things like that. So it's just planting that idea of, the way you feel now does not define you. And the pain paradox. Sometimes we have to point this out. Your clients or the loved ones of clients will say, I keep doing these things even though I know it's not working. Well, that's normal, right? Doesn't mean it's healthy, just means that it's normal, right? So survivors want to feel better. Nobody wants to feel invalidated. Nobody wants to hurt. Nobody wants to relive these really awful things. And so survivors will do things that they think are helpful. And it might be, for example, let me avoid this pain. I start having these thoughts, so let me distract myself. Let me change the subject. Let me shut this down. And to be fair, those strategies have their place, like with distress tolerance, or if you're in the middle of some big important meeting, you might do some of those things. It's when it's over and over and over and at the expense of long term recovery that it's a problem. So here you have somebody who's experienced any kind of trauma, and they're avoiding. And it might be things like they're drinking to numb the pain, or they avoid the topic, or when they have the thoughts, they do something something unhealthy, or maybe even arguably healthy, like going to exercise or something like that. However, where this conflicts is with our notion that experiencing the pain is the path to recovery. Being able to withstand that pain and process those thoughts, right? Remember the intrinsic processing. This is their brain saying, hey, this is on my mind. Um, Something's triggering this. I'm scared. I'm remembering some things, and so now what we understand is processing that is healthy. It is uncomfortable, right? Not everything that's healthy is going to be comfortable, and not everything that's comfortable is healthy. So we now accept as clinicians that being able to sit with that discomfort leads to long term gains, long term recovery. So, some basic principles for working with trauma survivors: safety, stability, the therapeutic relationship, tailoring, and counter transference. I'm sorry, guys, I'm having a hard time getting the words out tonight. So, safety, ensuring that they're safe from the trauma. So, think of someone maybe who survived domestic violence, right? Are they in a place where they're likely to be attacked again? If it was a natural disaster, do they have food, safety, shelter, things like that? Are they safe emotionally? Meaning, when they're with you, are they able to um, express themselves? And a lot of times, when people are in these really heightened emotional states where they just feel like they're out of control, sometimes they just need to know that's normal and you're safe here. And if they are doing unhealthy things, the self harming, the drinking, the drugging, all the extreme stuff, helping tone that down. Sometimes this involves case management and advocacy, right? It can be finding a survivor a place to stay. It can be advocating with them if there's like a systemic trauma. Part of it, a very critical piece of it, like if you take nothing else away from this, it's that explaining what the normal reactions are to trauma can be a huge benefit to clients to understand what why they reacted the way they did, and that's part of where that other video will help explain some of those things. I would also include safe ways of coping. Remember that I work a lot with young adults, but this would apply to really any age group. Um, Trauma survivors are at a very, very high risk of being re traumatized post the initial event. And what we see, especially at colleges and universities, is that the person starts maybe drinking and drugging to numb the pain, and then that leads to other traumatic events. So, someone maybe was initially sexually assaulted, they then drink to cope with that discomfort, and in so doing, they have too much to drink and someone takes advantage of them, right? And so it's just helping them find safe ways of monitoring themselves. The other part is, and I've seen this a handful of times, is even when there are no drugs and alcohol, they're still at a heightened risk of re-traumatization because um, their sensor for detecting danger or deceit or whatever it might be um, has diminished, right? It's kind of like having a compass that is not pointing due north anymore. And so they're unable to accurately predict. And it goes in both directions, right? That's where the hypervigilance comes from, where someone raises their voice and they have a panic attack over it because that's what the attacker did. I'm going to be attacked now because you're raising your voice. It goes in the other direction where hey, this person, we line up 10 people or 100 people, we'd say, hey, this person maybe is not someone you want to let your guard down around or get too intoxicated around. And that is not working. And it might be things, the way that would manifest would be, I'm always on edge. I need to calm down. I can trust this person. I can trust this setting. I can do this thing here. I just need to relax, and I'm just so broken from what happened before. I don't need to worry about this. And so that lends itself to being re-traumatized again, right? So helping ensure that they're safe and they understand what they're doing, where they're going, they have a safety plan, things like that. Stability, stable access to food, safety, and shelter, and stability with regulating emotions. In other words, they feel in control. And we're going to go into that a little bit later towards the end of the presentation. The therapeutic relationship, this should go without saying, but having a positive regard for your client and being consistent with them. And that means consistent with your sessions. Um, you're not canceling all the time, running late. These things happen. You're human too. We keep them to a minimum, right? And also having healthy boundaries. And that does mean you start on time and you end on time, right? Those boundaries for this person help. They need structure because so much prediction was taken from them. So having that healthy, positive relationship, and of course, practicing within the scope of your competence and things like that. If you feel a certain situation is beyond what you can do. So, for example, I have very little experience working with young children. To work with a trauma survivor who is younger than 10, I'm probably I would probably be unethical to say, yeah, I'm comfortable working with this person when I don't have childhood counseling experience, especially when it comes to trauma. Tailoring, again, tailor your treatment plans or your development plans to the individual. And this always fascinates me about trauma. You can have two different clients experience the same type of trauma down to a T, right? One, they may not respond the same way to trauma. One person might have that very textbook looking set of PTSD symptoms, the other one might not. One might develop it much later on or get over things more quickly. And even I said getting over things. One may heal from the trauma more quickly or have a different set of symptoms and things like that. The other thing is the person may not respond to the same type of treatment, right? So they experience the same thing and they have the same reaction. That still doesn't mean the same treatment would work, right? So you got to identify the unique characteristics, and I would add in the values of your client, what works for them, right? And also that's just sort of, I think, the person-centered humane thing to do. We're not robots, right? And so we're machines. You should tailor things on the principle of, hey, this is a unique person with different reactions and emotions and ideas and things like that. Two types of ways that you can kind of tailor things are through these different models, and we're definitely going to explore these much more next week. One way of working with trauma is the affect regulation model. And so some people will absolutely need help regulating their emotions, right? Um, and so some people go from 0 to 10. There is no in between. This would include when you have these really heightened emotions, how can you manage them in that moment when escape is not an option, right? So maybe you're in class or you're taking an exam and you get really hot, you get really amped up. What are you going to do? How do you manage that? That would be an example of distress tolerance. helping them identify specific feelings and what do they do with those feelings. So very emotion centered. And then on the other end, you have uh, identifying their schemas, right? For you CBT folk, right? Fix the stinking thinking. So with schemas, what can happen with trauma survivors is that someone may have grown up, for example, in a really um, negative household where the caregiver really puts them down. You're worthless. You're no good. I never wanted you. You're fat and you're ugly and all that nasty stuff. And then when that comes up later on, or they have a thought, or they hear something, they in other words get triggered. It puts them right back in that frame of mind. I'm worthless. So here's an example. Someone may have grown up always feeling like I don't matter. Mom and dad always loved my siblings more. Everybody had more than me. They got fed first. And they're an adult now, and you are running late to your session, and and those things do happen. And they now feel, well, of course you're running late because I'm worthless. I don't matter, right? Um, they may have been attacked or manipulated. It doesn't always have to be that big T violent trauma. It can also be the systemic one, right? They may have been manipulated or bullied or teased or whatever. And something comes up and they just go, well, people use me because that's what happens. I'm just an object. Survivors of infidelity, right? There's studies that show people who have been cheated on have had or do have the same level of reaction and a lot of the same symptoms as those people who are diagnosed with PTSD. So they feel horrible about themselves. Somebody hurt them that way. And then they start thinking, well, yeah, it happens. That's what people do to me, right? I'm expendable. I'm invalid. So what we need to do is identify those schemas. Like, where does that thought come from? What triggers the thought, right? Identifying the triggers, and then what brings them, what links it back to the original thing. Well, of course, um, he cheated on me, or of course, I lost or I got hurt. My parents told me a long time ago I was worth nothing, right? So we're looking at this. So we're looking at these negative schemas and trying to fix them, trying to lessen them. Countertransference. You'll also see a lot of times in trauma literature. It's known as counteractivation. And everybody remembers what countertransference is, right? Transference is when the client's putting their stuff on you, and countertransference is when you're putting your stuff on them. So this is where, if, for example, you are a trauma survivor or you've been in that same situation, you have to be aware of your own thoughts and feelings and experiences. Very similar to what happens in multicultural counseling, right? Where we say, what are your thoughts and values around divorce or abortion or whatever the case may be, your stuff. But here, what is different is it's not just an opinion, right? If someone comes up or comes to session with you with a similar traumatic story to yours, and then you get triggered, right? You get activated, right? Maybe some of your own negative schema stuff comes up, right? You, in what we would fear, is you put that on the client, right? Um, so how do you think that would look, right? Because it wouldn't just be you sitting there biting your tongue in the worst case scenario. It would be you saying, here's what you need to do, or why did you let that happen? Having the stuff, your stuff, put on them, right? That's what countertransference is. So if you're working with someone who their story really resonates with you, You just have to be aware of that and handle it in an appropriate way. And sometimes, when early on, that means speaking with your LPC supervisor. It can sometimes mean getting your own counseling later on in life, right? You're fully licensed and all that. It might be your consulting, right? You're saying, I'm having a difficult time. My client has this story. It resonates very closely with me. What do you suggest I do in talking to your peers? So we're rounding this out. So the first wave of working with trauma is to do some education work, right? And this isn't just lecturing, it's explaining what trauma is and what the reactions can be. And I'm hoping that these next couple slides will really highlight why it's important. Just having education for your client about trauma is really, really beneficial. Some of the things you might talk about are prevalence. Um, when I'm in, when I'm working with trauma survivors, I don't bust out statistics and things like that. And it's not to make them seem like just another face in the crowd. Is to help them understand that they're not alone and that there are many people who experience trauma, and there are lots of people who are able to recover from that trauma. And this idea that you are somehow stained or marked, that is a feeling. It isn't necessarily true, though, right? So that, hey, you're not bad luck. You're not broken. This is something that is horrible, and also it does happen. Myths about trauma. So I've seen this. Uh, in, I've seen a lot of myths about trauma in two situations. One is when the client's a guy, and that's just, I think that comes from that traditional masculinity stuff of I feel out of control and I have these emotions and these feelings and things like that. But somehow I did something wrong if I have trauma symptoms or PTSD. The other group is um, with sexual assault survivors, and there are myths in all different situations, but those are the two that I've seen a lot of. So usually, what I'll ask about is what do you know about trauma? What do you think trauma is, or what have you heard about it? And it can be things like, well, if I didn't fight back, maybe I wanted it, or maybe maybe I they say that if you can remember it, it wasn't too bad, or if you have PTSD, then you did something wrong, right? And so giving them that space to talk about it, right? I would expect there could be some high emotions, and it could be myths like that's it, this is the way it's always gonna be. I can't ever have a relationship again, right? And so dispelling any of those myths, if applicable, and only if the client wants to go down this avenue, talking about perpetrators, right? Not all trauma has a perpetrator, right? Like survivors of a natural disaster, there's not really a perpetrator unless like you want to blame Mother Earth, I guess. And so going into some detail about why does this happen, a lot of stuff comes up with why didn't I know? Why me? And every situation is different. I'm going to leave this a little open ended because I don't want to, I guess, influence how you would explain this to clients. There can be a benefit to understanding that uh, for some perpetrators, yeah, they were looking to hurt someone. They were looking to find someone they could they could prey upon. And other times it could be that people get too drunk or too high, and there's all these different things. Every situation is unique. Some clients, they don't care. I don't want to think about that person, and in my opinion, that is okay. That is all right. It's usually beneficial when they start doubting themselves or blaming themselves that, hey, I should have known better. How did I miss all those signs? And it's like, well, because that person was hiding that from you. Nobody goes into a relationship and says, I'm going to hurt you fundamentally, right? And so explaining that for some people there is a pattern, and you can have the discussion about what is grooming and things like that, what is deceit, and if there isn't a benefit to that, then don't force it on them. Don't force that discussion. Now this is the big thing, right? This is what you really want to focus on early on in those sessions. Um, what are the immediate responses to trauma, right? And so this is where we're pulling it all together. And so remember at the beginning of the semester we talked about the four big reactions: fight, flight, freeze, and acquiesce, right? So this is where those comments like, I just froze. I don't know what happened. I couldn't fight them off, right? Well, there is an explanation for that, right? That was your body felt at the time. This is the best strategy. And there are some biological and evolutionary reasons for that, right? Um, acquiescing, right? I gave in, right? Well, it's not so much that you gave in, you didn't really have a say in the matter. Your brain was like, hey, let's comply or it's going to get worse, right? Why didn't I stay and fight? When I work with men who maybe were attacked or in the military and things like that, why didn't I fight back? Or I was so scared. And it's like, right, because it's a scary situation, and your imperative is to survive these things. So explaining what happens, and you can go as biological as you want, but I think explaining that purpose of, your reaction, that was what your brain thought, your very primitive brain, the one that wants to survive, that's what it thought the best strategy was. You not fighting back was not an invitation. You not fighting back was not uh, some misguided or misunderstood want for the situation. You acquiescing was not the same as you wanting that, right? You running away was not you being a chicken or a coward, right? There are these biological and neurological reasons for it. And that's where we start dispelling some of the myths. That's where we start attacking some of the self blame and the self invalidation, right? I should have fought harder. I should have done this. That's not going to do anything. And I don't mean that in the sense of what's done is done. I mean that what makes a traumatic situation worse is now blaming yourself for the traumatic situation, right? They didn't ask for that. So this helps explain some of that. Or why don't I remember things? The client experience, right? So we've gone over some things, and all this sort of dovetails. Like, this is the part that's difficult about counselor education, is that the way I'm presenting it makes it seem like this very linear thing. You're not going to go into session and say, first we need to talk numbers, and now let's talk myths, right? It's going to be kind of a revolving door of these things. With the client experience, we're now talking about both what was the event, right? If they're in a place where they can talk about it. And I know it goes without saying, and it sounds very cliche, but it's very true. if they're not ready to talk about it, they're not ready to talk about it, and that is okay, right? I often in my early sessions, like the first one or two, when we've gone to the point where, hey, this is a trauma situation, this is what we're going to talk about. What I'll say is that at some point, yes, I do believe it's beneficial to talk about the trauma. However, we don't have to talk about it today. We don't have to talk about it next week. We will talk about it when you're ready. You're in the driver's seat. You'll let me know when you're ready. And if you change your mind, you change your mind, right? We don't have to, right? They were already in a situation where they didn't have control before. I don't want them to be in that situation again. However, I don't want to give a false impression that, oh, don't worry, you don't ever have to talk about what happened, because I don't think that's helpful. I think what's helpful is to talk about it. So what happened, and if they're not comfortable, you can always go to this place, and this is where I usually don't have people not want to talk about what has happened after the event. So their post-traumatic experience, have they had any symptoms? And you might have to kind of go through this checklist style, right? How's your eating? How's your sleeping? Any intrusive thoughts? Oh, what's an intrusive thought? Have you ever had just an idea pop into your head? Memory. Do you have any memories of what happened? Non-clinical things, right? So, what changes have you done? I dropped out of school. I quit my job. I started working harder. I started studying harder. I've started going out with my friends a lot more. And how are you coping with this? And with the coping stuff, we just want to make sure that it's not unhealthy. And when I say stuff like healthy or unhealthy, really what I'm doing in my head with a client is this something that I need to keep a pulse on? So someone says, I've been drinking a lot. I'll say, okay. And it's not like I say, oh, stop that. That's unhealthy. It's more of, okay, well, how much are you drinking? And they say, I just, a couple drinks on the weekend. Okay, cool. Make a little mental note. Maybe I put it in my notes. And I just kind of keep track of it. And if it stays steady or decreases, it's not an issue. If it increases and they're also simultaneously saying the symptoms are getting worse, right, then I think, all right, we got to find a different method, right? They say, I'm going to the gym. That's great. How often are you going to the gym? Or, um, I'm just dating, or I eat. We're just kind of keeping a pulse on what does that look like in any changes, right? Reframing with them. So this is a good ending spot in your session. That first session, or even one or two sessions, where we're talking about that intrinsic processing. And I would probably say it as, not probably, I do say it as, have you ever heard of the term intrinsic processing? And they, of course, will say no. And then I say, well, it's this idea that all this stuff that you're experiencing, and I'm not taking away how uncomfortable it is your body's way of processing what you went through. And it didn't make sense, right? Did that make sense what happened to you? No. Okay, so this is your mind and your body trying to figure it out, and it's horribly uncomfortable for you, but you are not damaged, you're not broken, you're not sick, or anything like that. This really is just you trying to heal. What's frustrating is that it's uncomfortable and you don't have any control over it, right? And I'll kind of let that sink in and tell them it's really important that you understand that this is how you're healing from that trauma, because I don't want you, having gone through this horrible thing, now blaming yourself and saying I'm damaged goods, because that's just not the case, right? This is the normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And that usually leaves them on a more positive note. You're starting to lay the groundwork for that hope of, so you mean I'm not broken? And it's like, no, absolutely not. Right? You suffered this really horrible thing, your brain and your body doesn't know what's going on. They're trying to figure it out, and it is going to figure it out. I'm going to help you figure it out, and and that's it. There's some growing pain associated with this, and I wish I could tell you it was going to be easy. I wish I could tell you it would be quick, um, but it will heal, and you will have your life pre-trauma, and you're going to have your life post-trauma, right? And we just got to figure out the stuff in between. Safety plans, right? Are they safe from the trauma? So I worked at universities. If someone was maybe attacked in a dorm, are they in that same dorm? If they had a really volatile boyfriend or girlfriend or lover, and that person knew where my client lived, do we need to do something to get them moved to a different room? Do you know your resources? And everybody has different opinions on taking advantage of different resources like police and restraining orders and things like that. But it can also be moving away from perpetrator trauma. It could also be, do you have a place to stay tonight? Do you have a way of getting to work? Do you know what to do if you feel, if you're thinking of suicide? Do you know what to do? Where to go? Do you have someone you can call at 2 a.m? Things like that. So let's wrap up. After watching the video from Jim Hopper, I think a good exercise is, how would you explain trauma to someone who doesn't know what it is? So a non-counselor, right? Try explaining it to someone. Don't get into anything heavy, right? Just how, or think about it. How would you explain trauma to a client or to someone who doesn't understand what it is or hasn't heard of it? Start thinking about, or what are your thoughts on the trauma symptoms as signs of the body or the brain trying to process the event. I'm going to post the link for the Jim Hopper video. It's a pretty long video, a couple notes about it. This is something that I know everybody's crunched for time. Everybody's life is upside down. Chip away at the video. You don't feel like you need to cram it all in 1 week, because this is something that we're going to revisit next week. I'm really bummed out that I don't get to talk about it with you guys in class. As interesting as it is going into it, please understand that he is not talking to counselors or mental health care workers of any kind. His videos are really aimed more at people who investigate trauma, but his principles and the information he has are still very relevant to us. So a lot of times you're going to hear him mention investigating, or his examples will be like, well, when you're asking them what happened, and you might be thinking about, why would we ever talk that way to a client? He's not necessarily talking about us. He might be talking about police officers or detectives or caseworkers and things like that who are looking for those details. However, when that client comes to you and says, the detective kept asking me over and over, why don't I remember? How do you not remember? Right? He's explaining why someone might not remember, and that's good information for you to have to help your client understand. So check out the video. He does explain those 4 reactions: fight, flight, freeze, and acquiesce very well. He has some other videos that he has examples of how this happens and why it happens, but it really helps clients stop the self-blame cycle if we share this information about, hey, what you did, or what your reaction was, A, was beyond your control, and B, was what your brain thought was the best thing to do at the time, right? It was not a choice, and it's not a character thing or a value thing, and it doesn't make what happened any more right. It's still a horrible trauma. But please stop blaming yourself, and here are some reasons why what happened or why your reaction may have been what it was, right? So check out that video. If you have questions or comments or anything, please let me know. I hope everyone is doing well, and I will talk to you soon. I gotta find the button again. There it is. All right, bye everyone.